the Passover, the most solemn occasion of the entire year, wherein the Apostle Paul specifically commands us to make a self-examination before participating in that most sacred occasion, taking the bread and the wine, to know why you're doing it and to know whether or not you're going to be able to do it in a worthy manner. But how do you undertake this examination? What is the standard of measure? What must you discover about yourself in order to be able to take the Passover worthily? Now, of course, worthily is the adverb there, meaning the manner of taking it, not meaning how you are, your condition necessarily. Although it does apply to that too, but it doesn't mean that you have to be worthy, understanding, of course, that none of us are really worthy. We're worthy of death, and therefore if we got what we deserved, if we got justice, that's exactly what we would get. And we'll always be worthy of death, so that when we receive salvation, we're going to have to acknowledge it as a gift from God as a result of His grace and His mercy. And that is precisely what God is teaching us at this time. And I think that's the big lesson, one of the big lessons He wants us to learn. That it isn't something that we're going to ever deserve, but it is a gift from God, a free gift. And then, of course, along with that will be a reward that you do earn or you do acquire as a result of your works. Now, what is the standard then? Is it a certain degree of perfection that we must attain to? Or is it being sinless or becoming sinless? Now, surprisingly, the answer to those two questions, that is, it might be a surprise to you, is a definite yes. We do and should have achieved a certain degree of perfection, and we also must stand before God sinless. Now, that's a big order. But how do we do that? In view of the fact that Paul said that he himself still sinned, and we know that we do. Now, of course, as I said, the answer to these two questions is yes. Yes, you must have achieved a measure of perfection, and yes, you must stand before God in a sinless state. Now, we all should understand, I think, quite logically, and see the sense of the yes answer to the first question, that we ought to be growing. We ought to be achieving a certain degree of perfection year by year. We certainly should have made some progress, in other words, over the year. But what about the sinless question? The one about being sinless. You're probably thinking about Romans 7:15, Galatians 5:17, a couple of scriptures or sets of scriptures I quoted over and over and over, wherein Paul was confessing that he didn't always do the things that he knew he ought to do, and he sometimes did things he knew that he ought not to do, that there was sin in him. As a matter of fact, let's turn to Romans, the 7th chapter. Continue on that thought in the 17th verse of Romans 7. Now then, it is no more I, Paul said, after he had just said the things I allow, I do not, and so on. It is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. That's in the flesh. Paul saw, he understood that. And I think, the very first step to growing and overcoming is seeing what Paul is talking about here, understanding this about the flesh. There's no good thing in it, for the will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. And Christ said in Matthew 26:41, I believe it is, that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. For the good that I would, Paul says, continuing in verse 19, I do not. I don't always do it. Paul isn't meaning here, as we'll see from other scriptures, that he never ever did any good. But there were times when he wanted to do good, but he didn't do it. And when he wanted to avoid evil, but he didn't do it. He goes on to say, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now, if I do that I would not, that I don't want to do, putting it in more modern language, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. Now, the Apostle Paul is speaking in present tense. It is no more I, but sin that dwelleth in me. Here was the great Apostle Paul many years after his conversion, after being knocked down by the strong light on the road to Damascus, saying that it is sin in me. I have sin in me yet. I find then a law even, a law, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. And that's saying basically the same thing that he said to the Galatians in the 5th chapter in the 17th verse, where he said the Spirit strives against the flesh and the flesh against the Spirit, so that you cannot do that which you would do, what you would like to do. He goes on to say, verse 22, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man, but I see another law in my members. It's actually a law. It's the law of sinful human nature, warring against the law of my mind. Again, the same thing that he's talking about, same thought that he expressed in Galatians 5:17. And bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. And then he cried out, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? I thank God through Jesus Christ. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. Now, did that mean, again, that the Apostle Paul was just letting down and wallowing in sin? Well, of course not. Paul is just saying here, and he goes on to illustrate that in the 8th chapter, and I'll get to it a little bit later, that if the flesh dominates, then it'll just be sin all the way through. But in this Christian life, he is showing here in Galatians again that there is this struggle. There is that law still there. And we're having to struggle eternally against it. As long as we're in this flesh, we will have this struggle. It will never let up. That's why we're told in Revelation and other places, it's those who overcome and endure unto the end who are going to be saved. And if you ever think in this human flesh that you're going to come to that place to where it's going to be a snap for you, that's going to become easy sailing with no resistance whatsoever from human nature, no fight, you are misinformed. And you need to become unmisinformed, if I may use the expression. Or, in other words, informed properly. And that's what I hope to do this afternoon for you. To help you to see, help you to understand this. There's a lot of deep knowledge in the book of Romans, and I think a lot of people just simply skip over it because it's a little hazy, a little fuzzy, and difficult to understand. It takes a little plumbing of the depths of it, of what Paul is saying, and putting together other scriptures with it to see it, to understand it. Because we need to, we must understand this. And I don't know of a greater Passover book than the book of Romans, except maybe the book of Galatians. Well, the whole Bible for that matter. And in particular, Paul here in what he is saying to the Romans. It is very apropos for this season. So Paul is not saying that he was just letting down and wallowing in sin, as I'll very clearly show you later on. No, Paul was fighting with all his might all the time, but in spite of it, that human nature was there, and at times, he just grew tired and weary, just like all of us do. And he let up on the pressure, and that, as I've explained it before, human nature like a strong spring that we're depressing as we put more of God's mind on it. We lighten up on it, and it just sort of comes right back up like a spring does. And then we have to catch ourselves and begin to pound on it again and pray more and study and receive more of the Spirit and mind of Christ to push it back down again and to hold it down. But it's there. It's always there, and it has an upward pressure, or maybe I should say a downward pressure on us. But anyway, it's wanting to get out of its place and take over and dominate. Now, Paul was not saying that human nature was dominating here. He's just talking about what happens if it does. And he's showing that there were times when it did come out of the slot, so to speak. It was released, and he let it get the best of him, and he sinned. But that nature was there. It was a continual fight with him. Well, now, how can you be sinless then with that sinful nature inside of you? Unless you think, well, that only pertains to the Apostle Paul. I long since have overcome my human nature, and I'm just having a free time of it now. I'm living on my bed of roses, and there's no struggle in me. I'm perfect. I pretty well had it made. Well, even Jesus Christ never had to let up on the struggle. You believe that? You understand that? Christ himself had that struggle. Why do you read in Hebrews that he made supplication to God continually in strong tears and cryings, and that he feared what was going to happen to him, if he didn't. He knew he must not slip. He had to hold on to God, and he knew it took a lot of prayer and supplication, which I fear many of us are not upholding our part in. And therefore we are slipping, and human nature is coming out too much, exerting itself, exercising itself too much.